All right. Thank you both for joining me. Very happy to have you, talk today a little bit about what's happening in Hong Kong and what appears to be the erosion of the rule of law. Joined today by Dr. Ryan Alford and Kun Shi. We are all three benches of the Law Society, but I should make clear that we are not speaking in any way on behalf of the Law Society. So any of the views shared today are purely our own, and we don't want to engage any problems in that regard. So thank you both for being here. Dr. Alford, Ryan, maybe you can share a little bit about yourself to introduce yourself to some of the viewers, those who don't know you, and tell us a little bit about the book you wrote that is on topic.
It's my great pleasure to be here, Joseph, not least because I'm here with Kun Shi. I got to Convocation a very strange way, where we all met. So I am a full professor at the Faculty of Law here at the Boer-Alaskan Faculty of Law at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. And it's a very special law school. It has a focus on preparing students for practice. So what we're thinking about is, what do students need to practice law? And I teach seminars on rule of law, in addition to the more quotidian courses that I teach in professional responsibility, constitutional law. And something that struck me as a bencher, we've all been through this experience, I think, is at Call to the Bar ceremonies, which will hopefully be back in person before very long, we asked students to swear an oath. So the price of admission to the legal profession is this solemn promise to uphold the rule of law. And very few students swear that oath knowing very much about what the rule of law is. And that's to no small part a function of the failure of legal education, that we don't teach them very much about the rule of law, or if we do, we kind of talk about it in a very critical way. And my focus as an academic is largely devoted to cutting back against that and trying to teach students that it's probably the most important notion that they have to grapple with. And that in swearing to uphold the rule of law, they're helping collectively to keep the profession what it is. An independent bar really is nothing. It has no purpose if it's not to hold the government accountable.
And is that what led you, sorry to jump in, Ryan, is that what led you to how long have you been a professor? How long have you been with Lakehead? And what was it, is that what led you into writing the book? And if you don't mind, give our listeners the title of the book and a quick 30-second synopsis.
Will do. And I just say the last thing I did before I started teaching, I had been in practice. I had working in international litigation and international arbitration, a little bit of cross-border M&A. And I left that in Brussels to go to Oxford University to get my master's degree in law. And I did a thesis on a court called the Court of Star Chamber. And people sometimes use that as a phrase, a star chamber is a tribunal-like process with no real due process. That, you're just hauled in there and without really knowing what the consequences are, the procedures are, or anything of that nature, you're then subject to draconian penalties. Became this watchword for abuse in the court system. That was the subject of my my master's thesis, and I talked about why the Court of Star Chamber was thought of in that way, and then why it was abolished. A sort of a central point in our legal history towards the rule of law, kind of this cautionary example of what we don't want to see. And so that was kind of my initiation to legal research. And then when I entered into a professor's position, initially in the United States, my idea was, well, why don't we know more about this history? Why do we have these passing references to this really important constitutional history, and why is it not taken more seriously? So both in teaching and research, I thought, well, how do we make the subject of rule of law, vital and alive for the students so they can take upon themselves this responsibility and take it seriously, and in a certain sense, animate their legal practice with meaning. So they don't see themselves merely as some sort of plumber. No disrespect to plumbers. I mean, plumbers are great, or electricians or whomever, just people who are kind of keeping the lights on and keeping the wheels of justice turning, but also doing this in a way where they understand that they're important to the system being more than just a system, but rather this means of keeping a certain political tradition, a certain legal tradition alive, where the government is responsible to the people and not vice versa. And so you asked me to mention my book. So when I came to Canada, I thought, well, how do I teach Canadians about the importance of this? And just a very quick synopsis, I would say, is this. The Charter has a provision in it that says that the rights, and people have been very disappointed with the enforcement of the Charter because of, Section 1, Section 33. It's like, well, what is this good for? There's a provision of the Charter that says that the enumeration of rights in this Charter is not to the detriment of existing rights. Existing constitutional rights. And the question is, what are those? Well, you go back to the Canadian Bill of Rights, which was Diefenbaker's initiative, right? Yep. And you say, it has the exact same provision. It says the enactment of this is not to the detriment of any existing rights. Well, go back one more step. This is the last one. Yeah. You go back to the 1867 Act. There are no substantive limitations on limitation besides division of powers. It's like which level of government can do what. Yeah. Nothing in there except for this one provision. It's the preamble of the 1867 Act, which promises Canada a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. In a case called Provincial Judges Reference, Chief Justice Lemaire said, that is why Canada has judicial independence. That is why you have a right to an independent judge in any proceeding where the government is against you, whether that's civil or criminal. It's because that's the gateway for these rights that existed in the Constitution of the United Kingdom. So the Act of Settlement promises, you an independent judge, right? Yeah. And I said, well, if you take that seriously, we understand that all of these things that don't exist in the Charter. So just one brief point. Yeah. Section 7, the guarantee of life, liberty, and security of the person, right? You see the Supreme Court making noises about how that would be subject to Section 1. It's explicitly subject to Section 33. So if you have any right not to be deprived of your life without due process, that's absolute and not subject to derogation or limitation. It has to be because of the guarantees that we got at Confederation when we were guaranteed a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. So our constitutional tradition, if we're going to have meaningful rights within it, we have to be aware of what we got at Confederation, which is pretty far for a lot of people.
What we brought with us, or what came. Oh, sounds like you got someone knocking at your.
I'm curious. I don't know who's knocking or where. So, but maybe you should introduce Kun at this stage.
Go ahead. Thank you. It's a perfect segue. Kun, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and where our listeners can find you on the web.
Sure. Thank you, Joseph, for inviting me, and especially with another guest, someone as learned and knowledgeable as Dr. Ryan Alford. I've been a lawyer for 30 years, and before I was a lawyer, I was an aerospace engineer. And to this day, I think that there's still an engineer in me, which means that I tend to question things at the logical level. I practice civil litigation, and in that life for 30 years, most of it I spent as a sole practitioner, which is slightly unusual because most litigation lawyers practice in a firm. And being a sole practitioner has given me also a unique insight into our legal system, our fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law, because I tend to represent what we would call the small guys. The businesses that I represent are small businesses. And in addition, because I'm an immigrant, I came to Canada when I was a teenager, and I speak Chinese fluently. I also have a view from the perspective of a newcomer who came from a different system. I think perhaps that's why, more than anything, I am fiercely protective of our fundamental freedoms that we enjoy in Canada. I see it as one of the most precious things that this country has. And I disagree with anyone that seems to just take it for granted. because I have seen a world where those rights do not exist, what they look like.
And oh, sorry, Chikan, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's fine. You were going to ask
Yeah,
a
I was going to
question?
say that that's led you to some very high profile cases. You've defended rights of individuals that may have been somewhat controversial, others that have been impacted by, traumas and other issues that were either highlighted in the media or difficult to do. And sometimes those cases can be difficult and challenging, from a standpoint not only of the law but from the court of public opinion. And certainly we see a little bit of that
Sure.
today. That's
Sure. I know that some people consider it controversial that I have represented Ernst Zundel. I believe that everyone in Canada does have the right to due process. I think our constitution meant it when it said that we're all entitled to a fair trial. And that's why I agreed to represent Ernst Zundel. It was to seek for him a chance to be tried in a fair manner for him to get due process.
yeah, fabulous.
So I think for a lot of people, they align Ernst Zundel's belief, anti-Semitism, with the fact that I represent him, as if that means that I'm also an anti-Semite. But here's where the engineer kicks in. I've never worried about it because I know that people don't think that criminal lawyers who represent someone accused of murder is pro-murder,
Yeah.
or representing someone accused of rape is pro-rape. I
Or
know
yeah,
our
or drunk
system.
driving is drunk drinking and
Fill
driving.
in the
I totally-
blanks.
Yeah, yeah.
I know that our system does not judge lawyers by the deeds or misdeeds of their clients, but that our system understands that lawyers, everybody, no matter what grievous crimes or misdeeds they've been accused of, is entitled to due process. And that's what lawyers are for.
Yeah. And so what's happening now in Hong Kong, you as a champion, let's say, or as someone who cares deeply about some of these things, you must, this must be disheartening to watch at times over the last year and a half, 2 years, especially since I've become aware of it, but I imagine you've been watching it for longer.
Yes, it is. It's disheartening, it's gut-wrenching, but it's not surprising because I grew up in Hong Kong in the 60s, and so was right next door to Cultural Revolution. I have seen enough of how the Communist Party of China operates that none of what's happening in Hong Kong today surprises me.
Scary.
It's unfortunate, but as a Chinese person, I'm very familiar with what tyranny looks like. I was brought up with it. But that is why I am so fiercely protective and also really believe in our system of rule of law and our advocacy for fundamental freedoms, because I know what it looks like when you don't have it. And I understand for a lot of Canadians born and bred here, it may not seem obvious, has to do with one's life experience. But I see it, and the engineer in me would consistently come out to question acts that are not consistent with it.
Well,
You talk about.
I think there's a fighting spirit in there, in addition to the engineer, from just our interactions and our time together, working together through the venture work that we've done. I just wanted to ask Ryan about his book, The 7 Absolute Rights, and how that kind of plays into what Chi Kun was saying. Is that something that fits, Ryan, or are we off a little on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, if you want to see what this society would look like if there's no rule of law, which is something that I think people have a hard time imagining. You either have to look outside to a comparator. And just to foreshadow what's going to come later, I think Hong Kong is a phenomenal example of this. The other alternative is to look back and say, well, okay, so this is essentially the society, within our tradition. And here's what happened when people who spoke the same language as us, who had the same sort of political tradition of us, what they were exposed to when there was no rule of law. So I think we're kind of going at it from two different angles, but what's so remarkable is that the picture that you see is clearly recognizable. It's that this is how power unrestrained by law operates. And it always falls into the same pattern. But what rule of law does to constrain that, the problem that we have is that many people, when confronted with a complicated gear mechanism like a wristwatch with all these complications and springs they don't understand, they'll say to themselves, well, we can get by without this and we can get by without that. And because they don't know how it operates, they're not aware of how it was built.
Yeah.
And so now, so it's two sides of the same thing. We're seeing how rule of law is built, and then we're seeing how rule of law is dismantled. Two very disturbing
very
sets of
interesting
implications.
Very interesting, because it's almost like a checks and balances that has been put in place over years and years of experience that at times can, well, at least to a certain extent now, we're seeing the erosion of slowly in Canada, and there's some fears of that. I could be wrong. That's just my general opinion, but a little more rapidly in Hong Kong. Now, you guys.
But Joseph, I
yes.
think that there is a more universal issue at play right now. Is we live at a time when people tend to get into stridency. You know, people like to come out with their sharp stick to poke you if they say that what you're doing is doesn't fit their standard. There's a lot of that. But in the process, there's not enough critical thinking. Again, it's the engineer in me coming out. That's what I experienced when I helped David Chen, the Toronto grocer, who was charged with really serious offenses for apprehending a thief. I think it played quite a bit in the media. That in all the talk shows I went and all the debates, people calling in, journalists questioning me, what I found to be very problematic was the lack of consistency in the thinking. For example, people say we can't have people wrestling people to the ground on the street. You know, it makes people uncomfortable. I think he should just let the guy go. It's only like a $10 plan. Well, I said, fine. If that's what we truly want, are we going to set up a system to pay him for our peace of mind that we don't see people catching thieves on the street? And then people say no to it. So this is an example of the lack of critical thinking that I find is a lot of problem here today. When people look at issues of fundamental rights, they don't always go through the entire thinking process to see what it means when they advocate and erosion of such rights.
Do you think, Kun, it's something that many people believe in name and in spirit, but when you know, at times when push comes to shove, perhaps maybe in the execution it gets lost? Is that, or is it really just mixed bag with everyone's opinions and beliefs, or is it, you know, other influence?
I would go as far as to say that hypocrisy is the disease of our time.
Wow. Well put. So I was going to sort of segue into and Ryan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that. I don't want to jump in or drive conversation.
No, that's a brilliant summary by Kun, and the people who would like to triumph or to hold up rule of law as a value, but then do nothing to protest its dismantling, are guilty of the highest hypocrisy of all. They want to bestow the honor of defender of rule of law upon themselves, but then not do what's necessary to preserve its architecture. Just as it degenerates and falls, other people are forced to pay the price.
Yeah, it's a weird apathy. You know, I'm sure there's psychological studies showing how, you know, victims in a crowd, unless they call one individual out, may not get help. You know, and I'm oversimplifying, and I'm not a psychologist, but you both were involved in some attention, both from the legal media and in general, from bringing emotion at convocation at the law site. This is all public, so it's not something that we're, you know, talking about the views or anything of the LSO, but maybe you can share a little bit of the kind of reactions that you received, and maybe describe the motion and why you felt it was important to bring the motion. I think Chikan, I don't know if this is something you're comfortable talking to. And
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I ever since I entered convocation, I was uncomfortable with the stridency of the Law Society's human rights monitoring group. What I saw was them opining to different governments around the world how they should conduct their affairs. And maybe because I'm Asian and we are forever having North Americans lecture at us, while we've been around for so much longer, it's like having a baby tell a grown up how things ought to be. You forgive me about the metaphor, but a lot of Asians get very indignant when North Americans tell us how to run our countries. It's disrespectful. So I have often felt that there was something not very good about the way the monitoring group kept sending letters to different heads of state around the world, lecturing on human rights. And so,
and leaving them out of it for a little bit, and because I know your satisfaction or dissatisfaction, with what was being done one way or another won't play in. I mean, when you've decided that you want to take a stand on a position, I've seen that inner warrior come out, and maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, what happened was that I thought that why don't we start from what we're doing in Canada? And I felt that the Right Honorable Justice McLachlin continuing to sit on Hong Kong court with the erosion of the rule of law, Ryan can speak about in more detail about how the system basically became co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party. They are the ones that have the final word on interpretation of the law, that the court couldn't serve its function anymore. And moreover, Justice McLachlin was not appointed to sit on any of the important cases. And so I felt if we are going to have a human rights monitoring group, then before we lecture foreign governments, why don't we ask a Canadian, a prominent, iconic Canadian, to do the right thing and stand up for human rights by stepping down from the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal and take a stand on the erosion of rule of law in Hong Kong.
And your concerns were really around her lending credibility to, if I can summarize from what I'm hearing, lending credibility to the court and not being on any of the impactful or important cases. Is that what?
Right.
Okay.
Correct. And her function sitting on that court, her membership on that court is something that the Hong Kong chief executive commented on. It's exactly what she said, that having these foreign judges show that the court is still a properly functioning one. So that is something that cannot be argued against. And the chief executive picks panels to hear the most contentious cases, the national security cases.
Yeah.
And Justice McLachlin has never been picked to sit on any of them. And in fact, Ryan could speak in more detail about the cases that she has sat on. They don't look like cases that are worthy of her expertise.
Yes, she's definitely a brilliant mind. Maybe, Ryan, you can tell us a little bit from your perspective.
Well, that's exactly it. And I mean, the number of cases that she selected to sit on is almost negligible. And this is increasingly the case for all of the what are called the foreign non-permanent judges at the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. I mean, they're being aptly described as ornaments of the Hong Kong judiciary, which itself is clearly becoming an adjunct of the communist judiciary of the mainland. So we're increasingly seeing things like, symbols everywhere in Hong Kong of the heritage of Hong Kong being removed and the mainland symbols being integrated. But this is just the level of what's cosmetic. I mean, as Chi Kun indicated, the problem that we have is that China maintains the right to rewrite the Constitution of Hong Kong. So
is that
just
under
imagine that.
Is that under the agreement they have when they took Hong Kong back when and there was a treaty agreement signed with the UK and them. Is that where that right comes from?
Right, but that same treaty agreement had a couple of caveats. So one important caveat of that agreement was that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights would continue to apply for Hong Kong. So this is part of the agreement between the UK and China for the handover of Hong Kong. So it's contingent on this. I mean, what we did was we took people who are British nationals who have a limited form of citizenship, unfortunately, not one that allows them to reside in the UK without special dispensation. But nevertheless, that these people who were subject to the British laws were turned over to China. And to its credit, the government of the United Kingdom said, subject to the fact that you will recognize that they have these rights under the ICCPR. And one important set of rights under the ICCPR are considered non-derogable. And what non-derogable means that in no circumstance, not even a major public emergency, can you say, okay, you know, we're gonna limit this right. So it would be something like laws that are not subject to Section 33, like certain sections of the Charter are not subject to Section 33. So this was an important caveat on this principle that China can rewrite the Constitution of Hong Kong. And what it did was it did this in the most appalling fashion with respect to what's called a national security law. So to say, okay, well, in matters of national security, we're going to have special rules in place. And this itself is already quite problematic. But these were directly imposed by essentially the Legislative Assembly of the mainland onto Hong Kong. So when there was no political buy-in in Hong Kong for the content of the national security law, it was just imposed, it was promulgated, and then integrated into that constitution. Now, as to whether or not that was going to be considered legitimate is a question for the judiciary of Hong Kong. I mean, if we had the government of Canada attempting to amend the Constitution of Canada contrary to its basic principles, you know, you better believe that would be in the court. I'll just bring in one relevant example. When Justice Nadon was appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada said no. And not only did they say that this is beyond the legislative power of Parliament to mandate, but that, you know, a particular statute that wasn't previously considered to be part of the Constitution of Canada was elevated to that statute. And that was to preserve the judicial independence of the Supreme Court of Canada. So when confronted with something of this type, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal did very poorly. And in a harbinger of what was to come, they said, well, when people are denied bail, contrary to the provisions of Hong Kong's constitution, in these national security law cases, people are effectively charged with sedition, that not only is it the case that this is not something that the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal can address, they're not willing to entertain arguments that this is contrary to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Oh. Now, those rights were expressly guaranteed to the people of Hong Kong by the Sino-British Agreement that allowed for the transfer of sovereignty. Now, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal is not only saying, yes, the mainland can rewrite the constitutional laws of Hong Kong, but that the ability to do constitutional review of those statutes is now gone. And the ability to judge whether or not they are in accordance with the non-derogable provisions of the ICCPR is also gone. So what is if a judiciary does this, if they say, sure, we can hear your case, we just can't entertain your arguments that this is unconstitutional. Well, then you see a rule of law that's been reduced to a set of formalities. And that's no rule of law at all. You know, if you can't make those kind of arguments, and a judiciary won't entertain them, and many things followed from this. But I'll let you turn back to your questions to Chief.
I think I was just going to say. So, what are some of the impacts that we've seen? Like I've seen on Twitter, Erwin Kotler, I think was vocal about a singer songwriter. I think it was Denise Ho that was taken by the authorities in Hong Kong and held without bail for about 72 hours, if I remember correctly. Might have been 36 to 72 hours. And I've also read some articles on targeted effects on specific news outlets, newspapers, and things along those lines. Maybe.
Actually, Joseph,
Yeah.
the most famous one is Apple Daily. It was shut down. Apple Daily was the most famous, most vocal Hong Kong media critic of the Hong Kong government, and it shut down. And its owner, Jimmy Lai, went to jail.
And have we heard anything about them at this point? Like, do we know if that's
It's
still the case?
gone. It's shut down. It's dissolved. It's gone. Period. Or another example is the statue in Hong Kong to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre. Also gone.
Oh goodness, they took.
You can't
If I could
even
just-
talk about these things.
Wow.
If I can hop in very briefly, the problem is what you see in the media is the worst examples. By the way, a huge number of these happened over the holidays in Hong Kong because the Chinese government knew that Western media would not be particularly active, like over the course of the Christmas holidays. But the problem that you have is it distracts attention from the fact that this is so systematic. So with respect to Apple Daily and the statue, so it's amazing. I mean, the newspaper has to fold because the Hong Kong authorities, and this is a special bureau charged with, monitoring sedition and political crimes, they've essentially made it clear that anybody who steps into that role to keep independent media going is going to be targeted. So it's not merely the case of saying this particular person committed these particular things. It's that anybody who would put themselves in the position to maintain independent media. And there was an absolute slaughter of independent media over the Christmas holidays. I mean, the number of outlets that currently exist is just slowly but steadily being reduced to zero. With respect to the statue, when this is absolutely appalling, the Hong Kong government engaged an American law firm to give them a legal opinion about whether or not they would be violating anyone's property rights if they took this statue. I mean, that really shouldn't be the question, but if they remove this incredibly moving statue that commemorates the victims of the Tiananmen Square massacre from the campus of Hong Kong University, would anyone's property rights be implicated? And the conclusion of the American law firm is, well, no, because all of these organizations that would have had a claim on this, including the Student Union of Hong Kong University, have dissolved themselves. Well, why have they dissolved themselves? Because every single person who's taken a leadership role in these organizations is being personally targeted under the national security law. You're stepping into the line of fire to the point where these organizations have said, and imagine the breadth of this, the Hong Kong Speech Pathologists Organization has dissolved itself. The teachers union has dissolved itself. All of these organizations dissolve themselves because they know that if they remain in operation, everyone on their executive is going to be subject to the similar sort of political persecution as the particular people that we've mentioned before. And then having said, oh, well, the student union dissolved itself, they then say, well, no one has an ownership interest in the statute, so we can just deal with it as we see fit. It's just so Orwellian.
Wow. And how
So
long?
I want to point out that in the same convocation in which my motion asking Justice McLachlin to resign was defeated, a motion was passed for the Law Society to send out a letter to the president of China lecturing on human rights and the rule of law. That was passed. And that's the sort of hypocrisy, Joseph, that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I hear it now. I didn't remember.
Xi Jinping knows
I don't remember
exactly
that.
what he's doing. This dismantling of civil society in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
It's not happening by accident. It is the most calculated destruction of the rule of law that you could possibly imagine. It requires remarkable planning, foresight, intelligence, and execution. And then the idea that they get a letter and they say, "Oh, well, I didn't realize that we were dismantling the rule of law."
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's just
Thanks to the
incredibly
Law
short-sighted.
Society of Ontario pointing out to me, Xi Jinping, otherwise, how could I have governed? I mean, it's absurd. And I think we would do well to not always tell other people what to do, but first ask, what can I do? What can we do? What can Canadians do about Canadian behavior?
Yeah. And I think certainly, like, two things. I look at it from Justice McLachlin's standpoint. The concern is really her lending credibility to the court. We're not criticizing her intellect, her ability, her past work, and everything she's done. but we're suggesting that perhaps it wouldn't be the best thing for her to continue, lending credibility to the court.
She's made statements. This is what's so problematic, Joseph. She's made statements that, well, if this was the case, it would demonstrate that the courts of Hong Kong have no judicial independence. And then the very condition that she stated has been proven to be true. So she made a statement which appeared to be highly disingenuous about the assurances that she had received from the Chief Justice of the Court of Final Appeal, that he was the person selecting the justices who served on these really problematic national security law cases. Now, I would also like to mention that he's always on them himself. So we understand that he's perfectly willing to indicate, for instance, that he believes that the role of his court is not to judge whether or not the impositions of mainland law violate international protocols that they indicated that continue to apply in Hong Kong. But he does this subject to a list. So he's choosing off a list prepared by Beijing as to who is going to sit on these national security law cases. Now, McLachlin indicated, well, no, I mean, if there was this sort of political interference, but I've received the assurances of the Chief Justice that this isn't the case, that he's the one choosing. Well, it's a matter of public record that he's choosing from a list that he himself does not prepare, but is rather given to him by the national security law officials of the mainland.
Interesting.
So if this is the case, we know that there's no judicial independence. On her own admission, there's no judicial independence in Hong Kong, and she has no business being on that court.
I was on their website, and the cases, from my understanding, the judges that sit on these final appeal decisions will rotate in and out for a month at a time, and there's about, I think there's 12 to 14. There was 12 initially, now there's 14 judges, and so it would be interesting to see that list and see how many times she's been rotated in on some of the bigger decisions. They definitely don't make it appear as if on the website, as if there's a selective process whereby, certain decisions or certain judges are chosen for certain decisions. It seems to be more of just an arbitrary thing. But
you have to dig into the mechanics of the national security law. But essentially, somebody could be taken off of that rota at will by the chief executive of Hong Kong, who is, of course, a Beijing appointee. So just to square this with my book and my observations on the rule of law, a major milestone that everybody recognizes essential to judicial independence is the Act of Settlement 1701, saying that judges do not serve at the pleasure of the executive, that they have their position during what's called during good behavior, which means they can only be removed by impeachment, right? So now you have a system whereby this schedule is made up and people are on it or off it, and it's this incredibly opaque process for who sits on what. Our constitutional tradition, the one that Madam Chief Justice McLachlin, upheld in Canada and was zealously protective of, is now clearly not being followed with respect to Hong Kong. There's just no argument that this could be squared with the Act of Settlement 1701 and its requirements for judicial independence. So it's so disappointing that she's continuing to give this credibility to the court. And I'd just like to mention, one of the leading experts on this is a fellow at Georgetown. He's a fellow of a center at Georgetown. His name is Eric Yanho Lai. And he was quoted in the Globe and Mail as to exactly what is going on in this. And, there's really no argument. If Madam Chief Justice McLachlin saw that article, and Chi Kun, of course, was also quoted, that article in which Chi Kun and Eric Lai were quoted, she has to understand now what's going on and account for the fact that she's continuing to serve on the court under these conditions.
Very, very interesting. And what for me was telling was watching it all sort of happen in a short period of time. I remember the protests in Hong Kong, the peaceful protests, the marches, and then from there, if you look at it from a time standpoint, how long did it take to go from where it is to now having certain independent media outlets shut down, any organizations that had any political power?
Just if I may, Joseph, imagine how Orwellian it is that the people who protested peacefully, right, against the imposition of the national security law by Beijing. That was one of the motives for the protests. It's that we cannot accept this, that they are being prosecuted retroactively under the national security law for those very same peaceful protests. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
It really, really is.
I just hope that as Canadians, that we would learn to treasure how good we have it in this country, and support and nurture and value the fundamental freedoms that we enjoy.
Yeah, it is a little applicable to today. I mean, in some of the battles that you're seeing in the COVID arena in Canada, I don't think it's exactly the same. I think it's much harsher in what's happening in Hong Kong. I wonder as to the total process time that it took in Hong Kong to get to where they are now. And I obviously it's a different political system altogether that's being retroactively imposed. But I wonder how long that process took. And I learned today, I didn't know this, Ryan, prior to the call, we were just talking and you mentioned there's a facial recognition and cell phone requirement of some kind that mainland China is using. I don't know if they're using it in Hong Kong, but maybe you can tell us about that.
Well, the question is going to make inroads into Hong Kong, and it clearly is. I mean, the social credit system in China is very frightening. And the basics of this are your ability to get government services, including obtain employment, get on a public transit, things of this nature, is conditioned upon the government's evaluation of your political loyalty. Like that is the basic indicia of citizenship in mainland China today.
And this
is that
going
your
on.
privileges are conditioned on the government's evaluation of your loyalty, your patriotism.
And this has been going on for a while now. How long is this that you're aware of?
Well, I mean, the question is, I mean, you can see this from the point of the Cultural Revolution onwards. Just the idea is that you are going to have a position in China based on how well you support whatever the political priorities of the leadership are at any given moment. And if you hold on to yesterday's today, that means nothing. That just on the turn of a dime, you've gone from being a member in good standing with full citizenship rights to essentially a non-person, right? Exposed to whatever form of persecution that the government deems as appropriate. So the dystopian element of this now is that it's live updated. That just with the flip of a switch, your QR code on a smartphone app goes from green to red, and you can no longer get on public transit. You can no longer get a job. You can, that you're required to do particular things. This is, and it's not just one thing. It could be anything. I mean, the basis of a negative post on Chinese social media, you've gone from a member in good standing to effectively a non-person. And the technology to do this is kind of what's currently being exported to Hong Kong in various ways. Although it's just, the problem is it's being done just gradually by steps until you just have to look and see that while you were napping, the borderline has been moved quite significantly.
I saw.
Well, Joseph, I like to point out that we are so lucky in Canada that people who are against vaccination could stand up on the highway, wave their flags, and express their disagreement. In China, they are pursuing a zero COVID policy. And if you go on the social media, you can see the tactics they use, including locking people up, and to make sure they can't come out, they solder the locks and put a slit on the door from where they will hand in some food from time to time. And if they don't deliver on time, you can hear people shouting out the window saying, "I'm hungry." And there was also recently someone cleaning the street. They blow chemicals, and then they use a torch gun to clean the street. And in the process, the flames from the torch gun, you can see that it touched cars and motorcycles parked there, and they had no concern at all. That's how it is. The complete lack of respect for individual rights and freedoms is something that you have to see to believe. And I just hope that North Americans, specifically, more importantly, Canadians, that they always understand the context within which we enjoy our fundamental freedoms.
Wow, that's incredible, Chikan. I didn't know that, but that's a great example. I mean, we've seen the big truckers convoy, the Freedom Convoy rolling in, and I'm in the city of Vaughan, and it was a big, welcome brigade that went out to sort of wave them on and cheer them on. That kind of thing you wouldn't see in mainland China, and I think even now in Hong Kong, from what I'm hearing.
Actually, specifically, you can also find on social media what happens to anti-vaxxers. They were paraded on the street with their arms pinned back, one guard on each side. The guards all wore hazmat suits, and the person wore a sandwich board around his or her neck, outlining their sin about how they didn't support vaccination.
Wow.
And they were paraded on the street.
And that form of parading somebody with a placard is just, I mean, it's so reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. And it's
Absolutely.
a sign that the government of Xi Jinping believes that that's entirely appropriate, that they did not fear someone saying, wow, this looks like how so-called black elements were treated during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It's just absolutely shocking. But just there's another point, and not to just add to a parade of horribles. The people in Xi'an, for instance, who've been subject to being sealed in their houses with soldered locks, they do things like they go on Chinese social media and they try to communicate that they're hungry, that they're not receiving food, and they have to use elaborately coded language because of the censorship of Chinese social media platforms to be able to get out to people. I mean, it's amazing how indirect, well, but to some degree, how resourceful the people are in communicating things like, I have no rice, I have no food, I'm starving. That they have to use these elaborate euphemisms to communicate this. Because of the incredible content censorship going on in China right now. We have to understand that the reason why we are not in this situation is because of all of these rights that we take for granted, and really start to put some value on these.
Maybe I could provide a lighthearted story I also saw on social media. The Chinese government, as soon as they hear there's a single case of COVID in a building, they will lock down the entire building. It may be a shopping mall, so you could go out shopping and end up spending the night in the shopping mall because someone in there had COVID. So they did it to some apartment, and there happened to have been someone visiting another person on a blind date. And they ended up having to cohabit because the person couldn't leave. The place was locked down.
Oh, that's the longest first date ever. Oh, my goodness. That's incredible. I can imagine. I don't know if any of these things are happening in Hong Kong. Definitely mainland China. I've been to Beijing a handful of times, and it struck me. And I was at one meeting. I stumbled across the art district, and I thought, wow, what is this? Graffiti and different expressions of art, and in Beijing, in the area that I was in, they specifically set that for artists so they could express counterculture in a way, and in an area that was touristic, so people as tourists can go and see it. But that was it. You couldn't, outside that area, you had to be careful how you express yourself. At least that was the impression I was left with. But fascinating to see that in a couple of square kilometers. It was just interesting.
Kun, do you want to talk about Let 100 Flowers Bloom and the big character posters, or should I do that?
If you can, do we lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, Ryan just asked you if you wanted to speak about. I'll let you say.
So, I was just saying, this reminds me of it, just to bring it back to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, to the Let 100 Flowers Bloom campaign and the big character posters.
I think that I can do even more, because in the 60s, while Cultural Revolution was going on, China did try to exert control on Hong Kong, and through trade unions in Hong Kong, and there were incidents of terror, bombs in garbage cans and stuff like that. And I remember a DJ was assassinated for speaking up against the mainland Chinese. So, and I, as a child, my mother had too many children, couldn't walk me to school, but I learned to stay away from garbage cans and unknown packages that no one's claiming. So and posters, and we sometimes would go and watch a movie from mainland China because it's cheaper. And the posters that Ryan talked about, and all the sort of even the postures of the actors is always very strident. And I must say that I find these days watching Canadians get very strident, it always reminds me of the posturing of people during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And it's another reason why I am so against the Law Society getting strident and verbally just lecture other people. I felt that it is not a good thing to do, that we do much better examining ourselves, safeguarding our freedom, and demanding more of ourselves to uphold and nurture that freedom.
Isn't it though, Chika, not to challenge you a little, but isn't it, writing a letter that of support or of concern, isn't that at least a minimum of something we can do to highlight some of the issues in international circles when lawyers specifically are targeted, or legal professionals or others are, the rule of law is sort of being attacked and trampled on? Shouldn't we do something at a minimum, or what approach would you prefer to see?
Well, and I would agree with you if that's all we could do.
Got it.
But that is not all we could do.
Got
I
it.
think that it would be more meaningful, and probably Beijing would hear us more if the Law Society passed a motion to write to Justice McLachlin and say, we think you should resign. Could anyone argue that passing that motion would be a more significant act than writing that letter to Xi Jinping? And could anyone argue that that motion is more within the purview of Canadians rather than that letter lecturing a foreign head of state?
Well, that's, definitely something that was even debated, I think, that day. It's all part of the public record. It's all available for people to see. It's, and I think there was a myriad of opinions. There was some strong opinions on whether we should be telling the Chief Justice at all what we think of her role or what she chose.
But we're okay to tell the president of a foreign country what to do?
Fair enough. Very good point, Pecan. Very good point. And I'm not the one promoting that view, of course. The opposite view. I'm just recalling what I heard. There was quite a bit of opinions, and
I will say this as an Asian. Sometimes I feel that the Western countries use the situation in Asia as a soapbox for virtue signaling, and I resent that. I really resent people writing these letters, empty gestures to Xi Jinping, knowing full well that he will never bother to read it, let alone act on it, while there are other Canadians doing things that we should be commenting on. And then we say, oh, we can't possibly do that.
Yeah.
It's disrespectful.
It's very disrespectful. And what made me upset is, it would be something that really would have an impact. There's no question. Madam Chief Justice McLachlin, we keep calling her that. It's amazing. It just gives you an indication of how people think about her. But she reacted in the press repeatedly to this sort of criticism, right? Right, stings.
And no one reacted in the press about the letter that the Law Society wrote to Xi Jinping.
No,
right.
But people in the Law Society who oppose this motion, sometimes I question people who engage in this kind of virtue signaling. Are you virtue signaling because it excuses the fact that you don't do something? Because this could be something that you can do, but you'll have to pay a price. The price you'll have to pay is that the framed picture you have in your office of yourself and Beverly McLachlin at a gala may have to come down. That you can no longer say, oh, isn't it great? Look at myself and Bev. And I've seen so many of these pictures, I have to say, right? It no longer has this value. It's no longer a token of how you're a member of this in club, right? Who, should be seen as somebody who is, having connections to centers of power and things of this. Yes, you pay a price when you criticize Beverly McLachlin if you hitch your wagon to her star in certain ways. And people won't even pay that price to preserve, the rule of law for the most courageous examples in the legal profession anywhere in the Commonwealth of standing up for the rule of law. It just shows the kind of value that they put on the rule of law versus their own the preferment and their own advantage, and it really makes me very sad.
Well, I think psychologically, when you consider a person like the Chief Justice McLachlin, and you've held her up at a standard that is just so much higher, that of a rock star, a celebrity, just like the use of fear, it might bypass a part of our reason, our ability to not to think, but our ability to reason. And so we just kind of believe anything you want.
What you've pointed out is very frightening, that maybe we are losing our resolve and our support for fundamental freedoms, that people are self-censoring.
Yeah, or maybe critical thinking, Chikan. I mean, that was the point you started us off with, and in addition to holding her up for the great things she's done, and for the things she's done for the rule of law and judiciary here in Canada, and common law and development of common law, there are those other elements that we have to consider that we may not be happy about now, and we need to think about those or look at them critically and assess them. No matter who it is.
She wants to do a book tour and promote a memoir where she holds herself up as a defender of the rule of law because she took a firm line about an untoward phone call by the Prime Minister of Canada. She's going to have to answer difficult questions about her inability to step aside when the justices of the court on which she sits are chosen by the equivalent of the Prime Minister.
Very interesting. Yeah, very, very sure. Chikan, any other thoughts? Is there, I don't know if there's anything either of you want to add that we haven't sort of talked about, but, I put that out there, and I also want to make sure that we share your website, Chikan, and Ryan. Go ahead.
Me first, because I want Chikun to get the last word, but I'll just say this. The inspiring example of the legal profession in Hong Kong, that so many lawyers have taken this seriously with so much to lose, is so inspiring. And I think that just is what we need to continuously focus upon. And Chikan is really kind of focused on that and the importance of that, of showing that there are so many everyday heroes in the legal profession in Hong Kong. I really think that we are going to shame ourselves and our own inability to, when the stakes are much lower, take a stand to preserve the rule of law. That is one of the reasons why this issue deserves so much attention. It's not just that what's happening in Hong Kong is so grave, it's that it exposes our own moral cowardice and really makes us take a long, hard look in the mirror and say, if something like that happened here or is happening here, what would I be doing? What position would I take on these things? Because these people are showing this an outstanding example of how important it is to have a moral commitment to the rule of law.
Certainly now, with a smaller example of the erosion of rights with COVID, you can see that there is a lot of debate about that specific thing. And what the expectations are, not only for lawyers and legal and paralegals and others in the profession, but everyone as a citizen of Canada. That very interesting. Chikan?
All I will say is, please appreciate what we have in Canada, value it, treasure it, stand up for it, and support it.
And I would add, think critically. I think that is the theme that ran through a lot of our discussion today. I want to thank you guys for both being here. Chikan, where can they find you if anyone wants to find you on the web?
My website is www.chikunshi.ca.
Excellent. And Ryan?
professors you find at the university. So if you just think about Lakehead and Borlaskin Faculty of Law, it's not hard to find me.
And
At least.
Twitter or any social media?
Oh yes, yes. I do maintain a minimal presence on Twitter, but don't expect much.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Okay, well, thank you again both for being here and for this lively discussion. And I am, really happy that we had the chance to sort of look at, the situation in Hong Kong and what's happened and how fast it devolved over 2.5, 3 years that it's been happening. It is truly a concerning issue.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Joseph.
Real pleasure to be here with yourself, Joseph, and especially with Chi Kun.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Ryan.